Hello folks in the English land, it's Lilia back here. Under some of my videos, some of you have left comments saying that you were impressed with the vocabulary that I used in some of those videos, and in addition to feeling really flattered by some of those comments, I also felt an urge to share with you some of the practical learning methods that I have personally found very useful on my learning journey. The first thing that I'm going to say is that my learning journey is still happening. I still keep learning vocabulary a lot, and I do that by keeping a special vocabulary book that I always keep at hand in case a word pops up in a podcast, for instance, and I really feel an urge to jot it down or anything. So that's something I do, and that's something that I think works very well for me. So I will share some of those other tips with you in this video, and I really hope that they will propel your own personal learning vocabulary methods to a great degree, because I know that they work and I know that from experience. So as I keep learning these days, I think that every opportunity, everything that happens in the world, every listening or interaction that we take part in is a moment for us to absorb some of that vocabulary. So here's what I tend to do. Because I keep my notebook at hand, I listen to so many podcasts every now and then, and when I hear a word that I think is going to be particularly applicable to my reality, I take no time. I just basically grab a pen and I put it down at that very moment. I tend not to count on myself to remember that word and just make a mental note of it and later on just put it into my notebook when I have the time. What I try to do instead is I try to be very effective, and at the exact moment when I hear a word or a phrase, I just put it down. And here is how I do it. Just to learn this in comparison, when I went to year 11 back at school, my vocabulary was very poor. It was really abysmal. I lacked so many words and expressions, and I threw in so many Russianisms and Ukrainianisms into my speech as I went on about everyday things. I had no understanding of the titles or words for concrete objects, such as a coaster, for instance, or let's say a pine cone, things like that, things that we interact with in our daily life. So here's what I used to do back then. It was everyone's responsibility back at school to keep a vocabulary notebook where every page was divided into two parts. In one part, we had to jot down an English word or expression, and in the other part, we had to write a translation. So I thought, okay, it's time for me to be very effective. So I wrote down every single translation for that word that I could just get from a dictionary. And obviously, those were bilingual dictionaries, right? English to Russian or Russian to English. So something like that. And it never worked. So I used to memorize those word lists for a very long time, but none of that worked, honestly. And I very often regretted being unable to extract some of those amazing expressions from the treasure trove of my memory, even though I had spent so much time cramming on them. And that was really disappointing. So I thought, okay, another method could be in place that I had not been aware of. So I started listening to English speakers around the world, and that was the time when YouTube was on the rise. So I went to YouTube and I just played some of my favorite bloggers' videos back to myself in English, and every time they just raised a subject that was applicable to my daily life, I would listen very carefully and attentively, and I would put everything down. So I would selectively pick the words that I thought had a direct link with my reality. For instance, when I was really interested in applying makeup, for instance, I just picked up words such as mascara or powder or toner, for instance, or base or anything. I tried to group the words into the topics that I thought they belonged to, and those topics that had a direct correlation with my everyday reality bore fruit. So I had a great time learning those words, and it's almost like the additional effect of watching those videos that really interested me in English was that I could also pick the vocabulary that I needed back then. I still keep doing that, My area of interests has changed, but I still keep enriching my vocabulary every single minute if I can. I think the key to doing that is that I really love the English language. I really love memorizing things. I really love training my brain and training my perception and training my mind. And I really love doing that in a hands-on way. So for instance, if I hear a word or an expression that I really love and that I think, this is going to be beneficial to my real life situation, here's what I do. I just put it down and then I say it out loud. For instance, just at the top of my head, I have some words here. For instance, in the artist recently, I heard an expression, as clear as day. I thought, wow, it has a direct correspondence, a direct equivalent in my first language. However, I have taken the decision not to use translations that much, because I think that translation, even though it is very cool in its own respect, it does take the time from actually speaking the language and just trying to create a correlation between the first language and the second language, which is a little bit time consuming. So I just try writing down definitions or draw a little picture next to the word. For instance, with this as clear as day, I just wrote down very clearly, and that's it. I also wrote the expression in a collocation down. I remember this as clear as day. And then I said it 5 times. I remember this as clear as day. I remember this as clear as day. I remember this as clear as day, and so on, which is something that you can do too. I think one of the things that hinders us learners from speaking and using top-notch vocabulary is that we actually have no idea how to pronounce it, or we feel insecure in our pronunciation of certain things. So when you just write a word down, make sure that you write it down with some minimal context if you can, and also try creating a sentence in your mind using this word or expression, and say this sentence out loud. Actually practice saying it. Speak to the wall, speak to yourself in the mirror, speak to a recorder on your phone, speak to your cat, whatever. Some of us think, oh, okay, so if I just write this down, this is going to be enough. No, it isn't. It isn't enough. We may feel confident and think, okay, I have written it down, I have put down some context, so this would have to be it. No, it isn't. It isn't. Until we practice to say a word or a phrase, or a word or a phrase in a sentence in our own voice, until we feel the sensations that accompany this word or a phrase in our own mouth, in our vocal apparatuses, we won't be able to actually integrate it into our active vocabulary resource. So that's something that I recommend so much. Just back to the pictures, I mentioned using pictures instead of translations, and I think using pictures works great if we're talking about concrete vocabulary. For abstract vocabulary such as transcendence, it's quite challenging to pick a picture, isn't it? Unless you're very creative, and unless you have a very clear picture of transcendence or enlightenment, for instance. Even though, even for enlightenment, a picture of a meditating monk will probably do, or a nun. But just, if I were learning a word, a table, I would think it would be more useful for me to draw a little picture of a table next to that word for a lower level. When I used to be at a lower level of English, I would use this technique so much. So instead of just describing the item and writing that a table equals just a top with 4 legs that is normally positioned in a dining room or in a bedroom or wherever your table is in your home, I would just add a little picture and that would have to be it. With that in mind, I really want to recommend that you work through the vocabulary in a way that you think is sufficient to support your learning. Pick the areas that you have a genuine interest in. Sometimes I like to put a word or 2 down and then challenge myself to use it sneakily in my everyday interactions. For instance, I try to sneak it in an email or in a conversation with an English friend or anything like that. On this channel, I have done quite a few videos that have to do with learning vocabulary. The final point that I'm going to make here is that good grammar should accompany good vocabulary. By using good grammar, by accompanying grammar with good vocabulary that is also natural and doesn't feel as if you're trying to be pretentious and just squeeze it everywhere just to brag or to show off your vocabulary potential. If you use vocabulary in combination with good grammar, that will create the impression of fluency, which is something that we're striving for. So experiment with the language, experiment with the expressions, see how they're applicable to your own reality. Go to my channel and check out the other videos that I have made on learning vocabulary. From a learner's perspective, I do know what it takes to expand your vocabulary potential, and I think that being able to use good vocabulary to communicate your ideas is just an indispensable aspect of being fluent. So if you really want to be fluent, if you want to communicate your ideas as clear as day and as clearly as you would if you were speaking your first language, go and learn that vocabulary, but also go and do that wisely. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to my channel if you have been finding this content useful. Don't forget to share this video with a friend, and I will see you very, very shortly in my next video. Ta-ta for now.